Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm Gail Fulton. I'm the director of the School of Landscape Architecture, for those of you that don't know me. And this is, I guess, the third lecture in the fall lecture series, the second that I guess is actually happening in physical space, which is a really nice departure from last year. Along those lines, one just small announcement, I guess, to get on your calendars is on Thursday, October 14th, we will have the Barbara McMurray Endowed Professors, which is Dwayne Euler and Jenny Wu. They'll be giving their lecture as part of that relationship that they have with the college teaching here in architecture this year. I'm going to do things a little bit different tonight. One of the things that I've always thought is a metric of a good lecture series is for it to have resonance across the campus. And as I got to know Nick, reaching out to him about coming into this lecture, he told me that he actually has a few contacts in geography here at UT, and I believe also maybe in sociology. And one of them is actually a former student of his who is now an assistant professor in geography here at UT. So as a way for you to get to know her better, I'm going to introduce her and she's going to introduce Nick. Okay, so a little bit different, but I think when you hear more about Nikki, you'll also be glad to know about the work that she's doing here on campus. Okay. So Nikki Luke is an assistant professor in geography at the University of Tennessee. Her research investigates the effects of urban energy governance on workers and communities and studies how uneven power relations rooted in race, gender, class, and ability shape energy policy and organizing for energy justice. This research has a regional focus, especially on the U.S. South, which is also something that our dean has asked us to start to look at in the College of Architecture and Design with the new energy. And she's also interested in working with students and organizations engaged within and outside the region as well. She holds degrees from the University of Pittsburgh in economics and environmental studies, as well as a Master of Science from the University of Manchester in environmental governance. She received her PhD from the University of Georgia in geography, and her dissertation was titled Finding the Time, Valuing the Social Reproduction of Labor in Atlanta's Electricity Politics. And I want to just read off a few of her recent publications, again, because I think the subject matter is so germane to many of the things that people are thinking about in architecture and design. One of them is called Powering Racial Capitalism, Electricity, Rate Making, and the Uneven Energy Geographies of Atlanta. That was published in Environment and Planning E, which is subtitled Nature and Space, in 2021. Abolishing the Frontier, Decolonizing Public Education, which is published in Social and Cultural Geography in 2021, and that was actually co-authored with Nick, sorry. Community Solar as Energy Reparations, Abolishing Petro-Racial Capitalism in New Orleans. That's a special issue of Energy, Past and Futures in American Studies, and that was published in 2020, also co-authored with Nick. And I thought this one was also very interesting to this crowd, The Glorious Failure of the Experimental City, Cautionary Tales from Arco Santi and Masdar City, which was published. She also co-authored that, but it was published in the edited volume, The Experimental City, which came out in 2016. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nikki.
Thank you for that introduction, and it's really a joy to be here today and to get to meet folks in the School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture, and also to introduce my good friend and mentor, Nik Heynan. And so now that you know some of my history, I first came across Nik's work when I was working on my undergraduate thesis at the University of Pittsburgh in a very different disciplinary realm. And I remember opening the book that he co-edited with Eric Swingadoo and Maria Kaika, In the Nature of Cities, in the underground floor of a library, and reading the first couple chapters sitting in between the library shelves, because that was a transformative text for me, and one that gave me a new language to start to think about urban space. So Nik, since, has continued to develop the ideas that were introduced in that text around urban political ecology in 3 subsequent edited volumes and countless articles. He is a distinguished research professor at the University of Georgia, where he's been for 15 years. And during that time, he has developed a rich body of scholarship on the US South, but he's also written about cities including Indianapolis, Milwaukee, and Atlanta and New Orleans. And since 2013, he has worked, or 2014, sorry, he's worked on Sapelo Island in coastal Georgia, with the largest, most intact remaining Gullah Geechee community left in the United States, and largely in coordination with his colleague, Maurice Bailey, who is the co-author of this talk today. And Nik's recent work, while building on this body of scholarship around urban geography, has also delved, as is true for his entire body of scholarship, into questions of gender, race, class, and how these uneven power relations transform nature and space, and contribute to relations of uneven development. His recent interventions around this are particularly, I think, informative and influential to many of my colleagues in geography who are here today, to my own work in thinking about not only political ecologies, but abolition ecologies. And I'll leave with a quote from an intervention that he wrote with Megan Ybarra in the journal Antipode, defining that abolition ecologies, quote, seek to enrich, expand, and extend the logics and thus possibilities of political ecology and environmental justice literatures, with a capacious understanding of abolition geography and its commitment, as defined by Ruth Wilson Gilmore, to show how radical consciousness in action resolves into liberated lifeways. So with that claim for thinking about, and that orientation to thinking about what engaged scholarship and work looks like, I'll turn it over to Nik.
Real treat to be here. Thank you, Gail. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Nikki, very much. Oh, we want to do a different, is that right? Yeah? Thank you. I come here today from a magical land, a land that has helped me rethink pretty much everything I've ever known. I was just introduced largely as an urban geographer, but for 7 years I've spent most of my academic and much of my own personal time on a rural barrier island because I've been so drawn in by the politics and the stakes of thinking through the work that many of us have the opportunity and the privilege to do. And sometimes the things that I've learned from this place and from these people have brought me wonder, have brought me inspiration, have brought me love, have brought me to my knees crying variously as I've been taken by the hand into what is just one of the most special places and cultures and groups of people who I've had the opportunity to know. And this is Sapelo Island, which I think is probably clear. I think despite the fact that Georgia drips with white supremacy and oozes with patriarchy and is rife with uneven development, there's still so much inspiration that comes from the organizers and the political visions of people like Alice Walker, whose childhood home was 45 miles from where I live and who I once took a pilgrimage to when I was really feeling shaken about living in the U.S. South and not really sure what that meant as a Yankee, trying to figure out how to be in solidarity with a politics that I didn't understand. Other people like Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., Nina Simone, Richard Wright, Zora Neale Hurston, and someone who I'd like to add to that list, who you might not know about, is a woman named Miss Cornelia Walker Bailey, who I had the opportunity to know, and whose son, Maurice, I have become very close with, and who, while not here physically, and I know it's odd maybe to have someone's name on a talk like this, but I felt obligated and proud to have his name on here, and he knows it's there, so you don't have to be like, Nik's putting your name up on things. About 7 years ago, I found myself in this place and started to learn around a particular kind of struggle for land and a particular kind of struggle for self-determination and a particular kind of struggle for survival. And as I said, and as Nikki mentioned, it's a barrier island, but it has the largest, most intact remaining Gullah Geechee community left. And if you're not familiar with Gullah Geechee culture, these are folks who are direct descendants from enslaved people captured, brought to the United States, working in plantations across the Low Country, and have remained culturally committed to particular lifeways and forms of living, oftentimes intentionally cutting themselves off from a lot of mainstream aspects of both white and black life within the United States, as a way to maintain a particular fidelity to a way of life. The folks on Sapelo consider themselves or call themselves Saltwater Geechee because they're on a barrier island and are surrounded by the water. Folks on the mainland oftentimes call themselves, anyone? Freshwater Geechee, because their connection to land and water is different. And I just like at that level of the geography of my experiences has been quite fascinating. Before I kind of get into my core aspects of my talk, I want to do service and introduce Maurice to you, just so you can imagine him quasi standing here, probably making jokes and calling me funny names. He's the son of a very well-known Saltwater Geechee author, activist, and griot named Miss Cornelia Walker Bailey. Miss Cornelia brought me into, or allowed me into, I should say, much of this, and forced me upon Maurice, as he talks about it, who's had to deal with me, and sometimes, maybe Nikki can attest, or other folks, I'm sometimes a challenging person to get along with and to deal with. Maybe not get along with, but maybe to deal with. Maurice is a small business owner on island, and we've been working together for about 5-6 years trying to revitalize agriculture on Sapelo Island. This was an idea envisioned by his late mother, who passed away unexpectedly in 2017. 1 month, almost to the day, after Hurricane Irma heaved her saltwater terror on Sapelo, flooded the hog hammock community, which is the name of this community that we're talking about right now. Maurice's most central hat that he wears right now is as the president and chief executive officer of a nonprofit called Save Our Legacy Ourselves, which his mother had originally envisioned to start and created. She passed. He decided to take it on. He's also the co-director of something called UGA's, University of Georgia's Cornelia Walker Bailey program on land and agriculture. He and I co-direct that in honor of his mother and the work that we do together. He's also the director of agriculture of something called the Sapelo Island Cultural and Revitalization Society. So I had first come to Sapelo in, I think it's 2014. I probably need to look at a calendar. At the invitation of Dr. Merrill Albert, who is now the director of UGA's Marine Institute. When Merrill had assumed this position, she was told quickly that the relationships between the University of Georgia and the Saltwater Geechee community had always been fraught, had always been tense, that UGA was seen as a colonizing force, that UGA did not respect, did not appreciate, did not go out of its way to support the culture of the folks who had resided on the island going back to at least 1803, which I'll talk a little bit more about. UGAMI was created in 1953. At that point, most of the island was owned by R.J. Reynolds Jr., who was the tobacco fortune heir. And at that time, R.J. Reynolds Jr. had dispossessed 10 previous Gullah Geechee communities of their land through having the only employment opportunities on island. So would strong-arm people, would tell people, if you sell me your land, or if you don't, you can have this job or you can't. And so to talk to elders in the community, no one really felt like they had a choice. And the end result is now there's one remaining Saltwater Geechee community on the island. And another kind of aspect that UGA, the UGA reputation gets kind of mingled with is that at this time in 1953, there was a community, this is the main campus kind of over here, that previously had been a Geechee community. And so, I mean, it's not probably surprising for those of us that think about the colonizing power of higher education, but this is yet another case study of these dynamics. I think one of the key issues to point out is that R.J. Reynolds Jr. had befriended and become quite close with an ecologist named Eugene Odom, who was at the University of Georgia. Eugene Odom is quite world-renowned within various systems approaches to ecology, and now UGA's ecology program is named after him. So it was that relationship and a partnership and an eagerness to work together that kind of set all of this up. As Gail mentioned, in a paper that Dr. Nikki Luke, who you've just met, and I recently published, and I would be remiss if I did not say that all of the really good ideas in this paper were hers. She wrote much of this as a term paper in a seminar, and we started talking about it, and she allowed me to tag along on her coattails. But one of the things that we talk about in this paper as a context related to this talk today, that in 1803, 1 year before the first president of UGA, a man named Josiah Meigs, presided over the first commencement ceremony at UGA, Thomas Spalding, who was the plantation owner that dominated Sapelo Island at the time in the early 1800s, brought his first group of enslaved people to Sapelo Island, including a man named Balali Muhammad. Balali Muhammad wrote the first Islamic text in the Americas, which is in residence in the nuclear bunker at UGA. And he was also the great, 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 great grandfather of Maurice Bailey. So when I talk about a depth of culture and a depth of tradition, the way in which these things come together is to be honest, like quite beyond my ability to kind of understand at some level, even though I'm trying hard. From this founding, and in this paper we talk about this, it's easy to situate the project of higher education within the settler-native-slave triad. This relationship that we've seen, and this is a quote from the paper, that has occurred simultaneously with the development of plantation agriculture and indigenous dispossession. In the paper, we argue that higher education is central to a system of frontier logic whereby universities were institutionalized to facilitate the integration of state technologies of settler colonialism and the proliferation of racial capitalism. So this hand-in-hand nature that we can witness unfolding through the University of Georgia is quite profound, and was actually made most clear to me through some of the research that Nikki had done for this paper, but also in talking to Miss Cornelia, who, upon initial interactions, really resented the hell out of me. And, which I later came to understand why she didn't want to talk to me. But tracing through much of this history has led me to try to adopt, I guess, what Nikki alluded to and what many of us are thinking about now, it's certainly not me, is the abolitionist mindset to much of the kinds of questions that I used to think about and act around in various sorts of participatory ways, that I didn't do so with quite the appreciation of this longer, deeper, racialized, fraught history. As a way to connect some of the stirrings, the political stirrings, and the political instincts that have come from this, I've worked to connect an abolitionist mindset with many colleagues, some colleagues, most essentially Megan Ybarra, who's at the University of Washington, to this notion of abolition ecology, which Interestingly, Alex, we were talking earlier today, and I gave one of the very first presentations about some of this, like we decided maybe 4 or 5 years ago, at a session that Alex from sociology here had organized at a conference. So it's quite important for me to think through that and reflect. Nikki kind of suggested what we mean by this idea, or what we're trying to mean by this idea. And I guess what I would say is that I think one goal of abolition ecology as a lens, as a framework, is to push forward through well-informed and deliberate organizing and continued theorization against and about the continued existence of white supremacist logics that continue to produce uneven racial development within land and property relations. So a real focus on land and property relations. Ruth Wilson Gilmore, a very prominent, very important geographer, has been talking about abolition geography, which we talk about in this paper and I've talked about elsewhere. And I think what I'm trying to do, what Megan are trying to do, is just take a much more narrow route to think through some of the political, ecological implications of these politics, as opposed to some of the other things that Ruthie and others who are talking about abolition geography have been thinking through. I think central to this approach, and an assumption that I think many people struggle with when I first try and talk to them, or anyone who's kind of working on this project thinks about, is the recognition that abolition did not end the day that chattel slavery ceased in the United States. The struggle is ongoing. The struggle is imminent, and the struggle is something that I have, as I said, I've only started to really appreciate through the opportunities I have through this research. At the same time, the calls for relations of repair or reparations have not ceased either. Right? There's still many demands upon the nation, the state, the city, the country, the ghetto, the colony that require attention. And so, in a very kind of small, feels small way, that's kind of what Maurice and I and Miss Cornelia and others have been thinking through and thinking about. I mentioned that Miss Cornelia was many things, but one of the things that she was an author. She wrote this book, which was a memoir of growing up on island. Highly recommend it. This is her map of Sapelo. Just, I'm a geographer, so I have my map. And just to orient you briefly, this is where the Marine Institute is. This is Shell Hammock, one of the dispossessed communities that I previously mentioned. You see Hog Hammock here. This is the one remaining community. I'm going to make a reference later to Raccoon Bluff, which I will not be able to reach. Nope. You see it up there on the top. And then many of the other names on here are other dispossessed Saltwater Geechee communities. Miss Cornelia fought hard her whole life to protect property and land within her community. And she took very seriously the fact that Bilal Muhammad was her great-great-great-great-grandfather. And the tradition that was stripped of her family, and the precedence that was given to Thomas Spalding, who was the plantation owner, who was a very prominent agriculturalist across the Southeast. So there are many prominent things and details that come out through agricultural ideas and theories and practice that get attributed to Thomas Spalding, the first sugar mill used for commercial production is on Sapelo Island. It was created by Thomas Spalding. Thomas Spalding certainly played a part, but Bilal Muhammad, who rose to prominence as the lead driver on the plantation, the knowledge that he brought with him from Guinea via the Bahamas, via the transatlantic slave trade, is the story that we're most interested in reviving and trying to bring back into the politics of the moment. Miss Cornelia argued that repurposing this agricultural knowledge could help Saltwater Geechee residents still living on the island save their land and working in solidarity with all kinds of people who could bring something to the table, a phrase that she used to talk about all the time, and Maurice now says all the time. What are they bringing to the table? How are you bringing something to the table? How are you contributing to what we're doing as opposed to extracting and going off and writing your damn papers? Direct quote. Is something that is a politics that I think, again, back to the work that Nikki and I have done is important. And she said, and this was a watershed moment in my relationship with her, and I sat for hours and hours and hours and hours at her kitchen table after she allowed me to and invited me in the house, talking about some of these things, trying to figure out how I could help, what could I do, what could UGA do. She said that in order to save the land and for her people, the people on Sapelo, to save themselves, Sapelo was going to have to be recreated. The land was going to have to be reimagined, the resources redirected, the knowledge recalibrated. Ultimately, she said the earth itself was going to have to be created anew. And out of this came this logic of re-earthing, this word, this term. She said it. I was like, what the hell are you talking about? In my mind, I didn't say it out loud. What the hell is this notion of re-earthing? And it was through this idea, or these set of ideas and the conversations that came about there, I started to realize like her vision of this total reconfiguration of power, land, outcomes of a people, and the world that they live in was in line with how I understood reparations, or how I kind of like read about land-based politics and racial capitalism. But not in the way in which she was articulating this. And it's at this moment where, I think that as a mentor to me and as a mother to Maurice, we started to see this notion of abolition ecologies in a very different light. Very important light. So, and I could talk about this stuff. I'm not going to. So I've essentially become a farmer, which was not ever what I intended to do. This is a picture of Maurice and Miss Cornelia and Maurice's brother, Stanley. And then these are other pictures largely taken by a colleague, Ren Allen, of us doing what we've been doing based on what Miss Cornelia suggested. So we have been planting sugarcane and making syrup out of it. And we have been planting garlic, and we have been planting sour oranges, indigo, garlic. I have a depth of agricultural knowledge now that never in my life I imagined that I would get, and not anything that I ever aspired to do, but it came out of these dialogues, out of these conversations of what could I do, how could I help, and her saying, you could help us with this agricultural revitalization so we can save our land, so we can re-earth this place. And it was always, again, I don't want to keep saying this, but it's so important because Maurice and I have recently wrote something in a little magazine called Scalawag, which we kind of wrestle with the fact that as a white guy, my connection to sugarcane and syrup and indigo is a pretty hard one, right? If I'm honest with myself, if I think about the way in which the transatlantic slave trade and the fact that sugar was one of the engines of the transatlantic slave trade, the way in which indigo was an engine of the transatlantic slave trade, for me to be like, all right, I'm going to plant sugarcane, like that's not something that we just did, right? I mean, it's one of these kind of reckoning moments that we've struggled with, that we struggle with now. But at the same time, Sapelo Island is experiencing an onslaught of wealthy white folks trying to buy up land to make second homes and fun little retreat spaces, while at the same time the ocean around the barrier island continues to rise. So we've been talking about this notion of double dispossession with another colleague at University of South Carolina named Dr. Dean Hardy, that the pressure experienced on this island with such great significance is immense. And how do we reckon with it? How do we reconcile it? How do we think about strategies, tactics, approaches, politics, etc.? Beyond the abolitionist perspective that I've mostly been talking about as far as like the some of the way I think about or frame some of the politics here. Maurice and I have started to work on a different register to think about not only the transformation of institutions that govern land relations, but we've been increasingly working to better take stock of what are the resources that we have access to already that we can build upon, given the depth of the history of this place and the depth of knowledge and skill and generosity of folks fighting to save their land. And so we turn to this power trio, all colleagues and friends, all living in British Columbia now, who wrote this paper, A Manifesto for Abundant Futures. And it's really interesting. And one of the things that they kind of start off with is the notion that nature must be confronted as an artifact of empire. But they say not as dead matter or remnants of a defunct regime that can be ignored. All right, so all consider themselves working at in the realm of political ecology or conservation. But to go a step farther in thinking with Ann Stoler, they say imperial ruins have a political life. They impinge on the allocation of space, resources, and on the contours of material life in the present. And they go on to say, colonial extraction also implies attempts to erase distinct ways of bringing worlds into being. Transforming these conditions requires political struggle grounded in decolonizing. A lot of discussion about decolonization these days, if you're reading political things. And a lot of them, I think, there have been plenty of critiques of lots of the things that have been written as being slippery and all-encompassing. And so I'm delicate. I try to be delicate when I think through some of the politics of decolonization as someone situated as I am. But I think that some of the discussion here becomes quite interesting when they pivot, as they do, as the main takeaway of the talk, when they ultimately argue that orienting toward abundant futures requires walking with multiple forms of resistance to colonial and capitalist logics and practices of extraction and assimilation. And in line with Frantz Fanon, this effort sets out to change the order of the world. To change the order of the world. So when I'm reading this in my office, I'm like, hell yeah, I can get behind that. That's interesting. Cool. When I'm reading that on Sapelo Island, and I'm like helping clean up damage from a flood, or watching another for sale sign go up and seeing rich white folks drive fancy cars that have just been barged over, it's a very different kind of reaction that I have. And so, you know, we sit around and we think about this, but we mostly talk about it in this context. So again, this is a different kind of map of the hog hammock community. And these are all these yellow circles are parcels that we have started to cultivate crops in, various kinds of experimental crops at times, sometimes large scale. That large circle at the top of the community is a 25-acre parcel. Not on this map because my GIS skills are lacking. Is a large fire break that runs here all the way up through this zone. And we reckon that right now we have, and some of you will get the significance of this, but we are working toward a 40-acre full distributed farm across the community. One of the things that I've alluded to that we wrestle with is the crops that we're growing we consider heritage crops. Right? And this is a pretty common language within agro-food studies. Right? But the wrestling question has to do with whose heritage are we talking about, right? And trying to work against this myth of Thomas Spalding and trying to incorporate the ideas and the wishes and the last words of Miss Cornelia has pushed us farther, because there's this recognition that we're never going to really be able to grow enough sugar cane or enough indigo or enough garlic to actually have the economic impact that I think ultimately is necessary. So we've been spending a lot more time trying to think through what are the other methods of value added that we can kind of work through and think about. And, again, like the only person I talk to more than my wife of 25 years is Maurice. Like we talk usually 3 times a day. And sometimes it's just like, hey, did you order the thing? And sometimes it's like, how do we get more value added and involved in, like these kind of like conversations. And one of the things that's become clear in that conversation, and I think I mentioned this, but Sapelo Island is surrounded by the sea. And there's a whole host of other aspects to this as a resource that we were not instructed, if you will, by Miss Cornelia to take up as a point of consideration. So while Miss Cornelia's vision was all about agriculture, trying to realize the significance of aquaculture has become literally, as Gail can attest per a conversation we had not that long ago, a brand new, hot off the press, I'm thinking live, real time with y'all right now, even though I'm going to have some pictures up, about the implications of this. Maurice remembers his first memory of an oyster as a child, trying to play with them because his father was engaged in extraction and small-scale cottage industry oyster selling and cutting his hands. That's his first memory of oysters. But when we started talking about oysters, it became very clear that oysters were central to the survival of saltwater Geechee people. The months when oysters were coming in season, everyone got excited. They knew that they were going to have a variety of their diet. The salt, the texture of flavor that otherwise growing up and struggling in a wood-fired house that at that time was very difficult, where they didn't always know that some of the meals were coming from at that time when he was growing up. Oysters took on this whole new meaning of life. And it's fascinating because I've had my 2nd through 20th oysters in my whole life from Raccoon Bluff, right here, because I just didn't grow up around oysters. I didn't know anything about oysters. And as we got into this conversation and started thinking about what's going on the bluff, and the fact that this channel is separated by another small island called Blackbeard Island, it's a river right here. Because more white folks are bringing their big fancy boats and they're riding them up and down and driving them up and down this river, it's creating a dredge effect, and the channel is deepening, and the oyster reefs are eroding as a result. So there's this kind of erosion. It's not through high energy of ocean water. It's through these kind of development impacts that are going on. And so we've been starting to think about this. Now, I said to Jason or Gail a little bit ago that much of the way that I have done research has not been like, okay, I'm going to study this. I have found myself in these circumstances and situations that like research presents itself to me. And simultaneously, as Maurice and I are starting to have these like kind of weird conversations about aquaculture, I get enlisted in a very different kind of weird project with a bunch of white dudes. Tyler, Leslie, Hunt Revel, Nik Heynan. Essentially the project as it was, and this was happening like independently of any of these other conversations, was about Hunt's idea of wanting to divert oyster shells from seafood restaurants in Athens, Georgia, out of the waste stream. We all three live on the same street, and we're having beer together one night, and Hunt says, hey, Nick, you want to participate? me being me, I was like, sure, sounds great. I don't have any idea what you're talking about. But, and I have not had a whole lot of oysters. I'm not committed to oysters. And this was literally 20 weeks ago. This was 20 weeks ago that this happened. And we have every week for 20 weeks now done this in this green Tacoma, driven across Athens, set up relationships with seafood restaurants, and started to accumulate. Right now we're at 5,426.75 pounds of oyster shell on a farm on the north side of Athens that are curing. When we started this project, and me deferring to Hunt and Tyler, being like, hey, y'all, what are we going to do with this? There were no immediate answers. There was no real sense. Fortunately for me, both Tyler and Hunt had worked in the fields on Sapelo. So they already had a sense of what I was doing in this world. So the conversation started happening about, like, whoa, maybe we could grind the oysters up for soil amendment, right? Or whoa, maybe, like again, drinking beer on porches, talking about some of these things. And come to kind of get down into some of these, so essentially we spent a lot of time on the practical nuts and bolts of, like, how is the charm recycling place, how many of these are they going to give us? Like, there's a lot of logistics involved in something like this, let alone trying to figure out the purposing. So after we kind of worked through the nuts and bolts and started to recognize that regardless of what we're going to do it in partnership with Maurice, and we're going to do it in partnership with Solo, and we're going to ultimately now probably do it at Raccoon Bluff, which is that spot, and we're going to ultimately try to reseed the oyster reef that is being degraded, right? It's still like, I hadn't anyway, thought too much about the larger implications of this. So being interested in things, I looked out and around the world to see who else was talking about things like this. And as many of you probably know, there are a lot of people talking about this. Like, this is like, we're not creating anything new here. And it just turns out that one of the most prominent people talking about this is a landscape architect, who freaking got a MacArthur Genius Award in part for thinking about this and other really cool stuff. And so I started really paying a lot of attention to what our landscape architect Kate Orff and her colleagues at the Scape Studio have been talking about in the context of oyster reclamation, oyster shell architecture, oyster-tecture, all these kinds of things. In 2009, and so I don't know how many of you maybe don't know, Kate Orff is on faculty at Columbia and is the director of this design studio called Scape in New York. In 2009, she was commissioned by the Museum of Modern Art to create this installation called Oyster-tecture, which, and I quote from, so this is last month in the New Yorker, right? Just to say how hot off the press some of this stuff is. This is from, and the author is a colleague who's a sociologist at NYU, who's written on his own stuff all kinds of fascinating things. He wrote this about Kate Orff, that the project imagined a living reef in the canal made of tangles and webs of fuzzy rope that, by harnessing the filtration powers of shellfish and eelgrass, would help support a resurgence of aquatic biodiversity. And so, like, the vision that Orff and colleagues had of this, like, commons space that would allow for people to mingle and have ideas and very creative in a zone of Brooklyn that had kind of become defunct for socializing, right? And one of the coolest, like, not cool, she actually has talked about how pissed off it made her, but the Times, New York Times, a critic of the New York Times, Nikolai Aurosov, belittled Orff's and et al.'s project as an effort to turn back the clock to a time when New York was an oyster capital of the world. He found it slightly hokey, which he ascribed to Kate Orff being one of the show's young and relatively untested contributors. All right? So I dug deeper into this because it's fascinating to me. And as I clearly demonstrated earlier today, I don't know anything about design or architecture. So I kind of went down various rabbit holes and came across all kinds of very interesting things. And for me, trying to think about what are the political ramifications of something like this that says life cycle as strategy, right? That's based on oyster shells and is doing all these super cool things around urban form. And I found Orff et al.'s book, Toward an Urban Ecology. And in there, they suggest, by emphasizing the potential of landscape to mediate relations between communities and infrastructure, Scape's method suggests that it is possible to catalyze new forms of both. And another quote that really caught my attention in here is their suggestion that a public is a community, but not one defined by geography or demographics. Rather, it is constituted through commonly held aspirations, heated debates about ideas, aesthetic experiences, and shared work. I want to read that one again. A public is a community, but not one defined by geography or demographics. Blah, 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 blah. I've been sitting with that. This is some of the real-time thing I'm doing right now, because I'm still sitting with that assertion as a geographer. But the thing that started to become more interesting to me, I mean, this is interesting, but like back to the politics of this for me, was looking at some of the liaising that Kate Orff et al. Have been doing with these two and a whole large crew of other people. So I found the Billion Oyster Project and realized that, interestingly, and again, I was once upon a time floating in a quarry with him, drinking a beer, and I had no idea about the magnitude of like what he was doing in the New York Harbor because my colleague friend Hunt had gone to NYU, the New School, and had done work with this. So Hunt has like known about all of these things and was like kind of gradually bringing me in. This in itself is interesting. They intend to bring back 1 billion oysters and reseed the New York Harbor, which on itself, ecologically, is very interesting to me. But what's more interesting to me is the politics that they kind of talk about this within, which is through a very kind of adamant anti-racist policy and a politics. And so as we've been trying to think through, there's now Hunt has created an LLC called Shell to Shore. We're partnering with Solo. We're starting to partner with the Billion Oyster Project to create this flow of oysters, but also within this politics. And I think that going back to the abolitionist approaches, which again might feel very kind of theoretical in many ways, is obviously kind of aspiring to connect to real anti-racist, on-the-ground efforts to call out and work against white supremacy. Which the critique of Orff's project and as being hokey offered a real interesting opportunity because, again, once I start digging, I'm like finding all these different things that like people aren't talking about for whatever reason. And one of the reasons is that, again, history is whitewashed so often that we miss out on some of the kind of black histories that undergird much of the social reality that many folks know. So not only was New York once upon a time the oyster capital of the world, it was a black man and an abolitionist named Thomas Downing who kind of was a central figure in the rise of the oyster from a working person's food stuff to the high culinary, highfalutin thing that it is today. And as the history of black aquaculture goes, which is something that I'm now kind of digging into, black folks who left Maryland and Virginia, two of the most oyster-rich slave states, became central to the oystering traditions all along, up and down the East Coast. And in the 1820s, most registered oystermen were black. Right? Traditions that go way back. And again, this might be common knowledge to many folks, but is not getting talked about in any of the contemporary writing about oyster texture or some of these very important and quite brilliant ideas around sea level rise, right? So it's like, oh, I didn't have enough room in the deadline. I don't know why some of these things don't get talked about. And I suspect it's just because folks, just don't know. And that's fine. So that gives us collectively an opportunity to think through different inroads. As Thomas Downing was doing this work of raising the status of oysters, simultaneously, 3 floors down in the cellar of the big oyster house was one of the most important stops on the Underground Railroad, bringing folks from enslavement in the U.S. South up to freedom, as that narrative goes. I know it's a much more complicated narrative, but escaping bondage and the work of the Underground Railroad is obviously very central and important. If we really, really want to go be deep historians, deep historians, which I'm not so good at doing, but this project is now lit a fire, we can think about these ideas that Orff is discussing. And, it's obviously not an accident. I've known about many of the things that I'm talking about today in isolated ways, but pulling them together has been part of this, is that it's become clear over the last decade that along the Georgia coast and on Sapelo Island, we have some of the oldest structures that indigenous folks built up to 45,000 years ago. No, 4,500. 4,500 years ago. All right? So this again is a map of Sapelo Island. There were 3 shell rings that have been found by an interdisciplinary team led by an archaeologist colleague of mine, Victor Thompson, at UGA, who 10 years ago, he was telling me about his work on these shell rings, and I was like, cool, man. Super interesting. And I always take folks to see them. But, recognizing the ingenuity of the indigenous folks that inhabited Sapelo that long ago has always been an afterthought to the other things that we were doing. Start to get into this and start to think about the fact that oyster reefs were an integral part of Native American and indigenous landscape. And Victor's study shows a high level of sustainability of the oyster reefs through their kind of engagement, right? So the story of oystering goes that it was the industrialization that ruined the reefs. It was capitalism that ruined the reefs. Shocker. But like the history of Thomas Downing, these indigenous histories are absent from contemporary discussions of oyster culture. And here is a rendering of this is a site. These are historical renderings of the infrastructures on Sapelo, what they might have looked like. Talking to Maurice about this again, and us talking about this together. When he was a kid, when his parents had access to a vehicle or variously had vehicles, on Sundays they would drive around the island. And they would always go to the one visible, it's called Ring 3. They would go there, and Miss Cornelia would talk to the children, 4 of them at that time, about the significance of this structure. And Maurice is very honest about the fact that he was a kid and he saw a mountain. It was the only mountain on the island, so they would go play. And it was as he became older and quite contemporarily, as we've been talking about some of these things, that he has recognized these very interesting but fraught and very complicated relationships between saltwater Geechee culture and indigenous cultures that existed in the way back, and trying to think through these practices of sustainability, living with the sea, living with the land, recognizing that there's more here to kind of tap into. So as I said, and it's probably eminently clear at this point of this talk, because we spend so much time turning soil, planting sugarcane, we spend much more time being farmers than being academics or sitting at a computer. It's oftentimes pretty difficult for me to make sense of much of what we've been doing or much of what we're trying to do. It's just very close. So I'm very fortunate that there are other scholars out there that are doing fascinating work that we can read and that we talk about to try and reflect back on the work that we're doing. And so Sharon Fuller has done a fair bit of work around Gullah Geechee traditions, land-based practice, mostly in South Carolina. So again, I'm not looking to conflate, because I recognize now in very significant ways that folks on Sapelo identify and don't identify with other Geechee communities in different ways. But that said, there's some resonance here in Fuller's work, and it goes back to the manifesto for that Rosemary, Jessica, and Juanita have talked about when she recently wrote, and this is this year, this is a 2021 publication, so it's, whatever, been trickling through. Gullah Geechee intimate knowledge of local ecology and available resources yields abundances not available to others. Their cultural practices exemplify the power of giving fundamental precedence to their indigenous ontology of communal well-being and the cultural values of reciprocity, sharing, and cooperation. This is a great paper. And I think, had I read this paper without ever been to Sapelo, I would have been like, this is a great paper. This is like, I'm learning, I'm thinking. Right? It has a different kind of meaning, I think, through some of this work. This notion of an intimacy with the local ecology. Again, local ecology is I never heard Miss Cornelia say that term. Maurice and I do not talk about ecology. Right? We talk about soil. We talk about fertility. We do talk about abundance. Right? We talk about resources. We talk about things that Saltwater Geechee folks have always talked about. And so, obviously there's a tension, and I feel like, some discomfort with this trying to walk this line that I'm trying to walk, or that we're trying to walk together. But everything inside of me tells me that it's like a necessary tension. It's a necessary struggle to think through, to work through, to think through this notion of re-earthing, the agriculture, the aquaculture, always within the context of the notion of double dispossession. Because in the 8 years that I've been going there, I have watched parcel after parcel go up for sale and have big houses built on it that white folks live in. And I have seen Saltwater Geechee descendants cry and feel like it's just a matter of time. The fact that I can start off a talk, and that Nikki set up the talk by saying, this is the largest, most intact remaining Gullah Geechee community, like, that is not something that I think they have ever taken for granted. They feel the pressures of cultural genocide every day. And that was something that Miss Cornelia was clear to make me think about. Sorry. So, in many ways, my relationship with Maurice and Miss Cornelia brought much greater and much needed clarity about what abolitionist and kind of decolonial solidarity on a former plantation on Sapelo Island looks like amidst the continued presence of the University of Georgia. As I said, I came to this place as an urban geographer, trying to think about this place in relationship to Atlanta. And the politics and the struggle and the creativity and the love and the compassion kind of swept me aside. You could say I've gone gonzo in the Hunter S. Thompson sense. I think that constantly now reflecting back on cities like New Orleans and Atlanta about some of the things I'm learning here, my urban imagination continues to still benefit from this experience. And one of the things that I think the value of remaking and re-earthing portions of Sapelo that benefit Hog Hammock, benefit the descendants of Bilal Muhammad through this collective effort helps to do, or is based in, are these long-term relationships. I've never experienced a long-term relationship like this one here. Not probably in my life, actually, but certainly not academically. And so the generative kind of impacts that come out of that have been, again, I'm very grateful for them. I think that mostly that has come about through my willingness to feel confused, as I clearly am, as I'm demonstrating right now in many ways. Right, my lack or my willingness to not feel like I'm the expert in the room, to be vulnerable to other ways of thinking and knowing. And, I don't claim to say I do that well. Right? That's the aspiration in many ways, right? Having been disciplined by the academy in particular ways. And as inspired and motivated as I am by Kate Orff's and Scape's efforts, as I signaled, I think I'm nervous. I mean, maybe this is something we could talk about. I feel pretty nervous about the suggestion that a public is not defined by geography or demographics. And I think, and I actually give them the benefit of the doubt, I don't know any of these people, but they're clearly very smart, smarter than me. I give them credit, and I think what they're doing is they're trying to aspirationally build a more inclusive community. Right? They're trying to not be exclusive by saying that it's not defined by geography or demographics. That's the point that I take. But I think at the same time, if we do that, it's too easy to whitewash these histories. I think it's too easy to not recognize the resources, the strengths, the skills, the knowledge that have come before through geography and demographics of particular communities. So ultimately, I think that decolonizing public higher education and working on projects like this where public higher education touches down so often, so many times, necessitates a situated and embodied geography. It necessitates a situated and embodied geography, without which I would not have been able to figure out or make any of these kind of well, that's too far. I would not have for myself come to learn these things. And I think I want to stop right there. And I want to say thank you all very much.
I think we need the mic, maybe? Nick, thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, there's so many aspects to what you're presenting that seem to me to almost be like a kind of that this place and your engagement with is a remote sensing, of larger conditions. One of the reversals that I see you partaking in here is this abundance versus scarcity. And just thinking, I think almost all of the rhetoric around sustainability, not all, but almost all that I've heard is built on scarcity thinking. And that's why I think, what you've talked about here and the number of essays that use the notion of abundance. I just wonder, like for you, is that, I mean, are you, like what I'm hearing in that it is a kind of reversal or changing in field that you're learning here that we might apply to other kind of assumptions that we've made about models of resiliency, sustainable practice. I mean, obviously, I think the discourse of scarcity is, a capitalistic construct, and so
can you talk a little bit more about abundance and?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you know, like oftentimes, like 2 weeks ago, I just taught in a directed readings Darwin's what you call it, a species. What's it called? Origin. Thank you. End of a talk, brain. Origin of Species and Peter Kropotkin's Mutual Aid, right? If you lay these two books out, one is saying survival of the fittest, one is saying that species require coexistence, like depending on what species you want to look at. And, you know, Jason, per your comment, Darwin obviously gets taken up into society, right? The survival of the fittest becomes a model, a metaphor for capitalism, advanced capitalism. Mutual aid, Kropotkin, now we hear a lot more about mutual aid, thank goodness, through various kinds of organizing traditions, right? But Charles Darwin won that, just like Thomas Malthus won the discussion around overpopulation and scarcity, right? So I think that there's something here that, you know, and what Fuller talks about is just this very different ontology. It's just a very different set of concepts that come out of a very different experience, and one that I'm not privy to, other than sort of, maybe, on the far fringes of now. And I think, you know, like I'm sure that many of us in the room have contacts with people that blow your minds on a regular basis through their experiences. And I think that's what's going on here. But I think that the pressure of the circumstance and the fact that, you know, early conversations with Miss Cornelia started off with, we are experiencing cultural genocide. We're not going to be here much longer if we can't figure out how to harness what we know to harness what we have. And that what they have is an abundance of skill and knowledge and experience and resources. And so I think that it is a reorientation, and it's one that is very common within indigenous politics. You know, I mean, I'm not going to conflate indigenous politics with Gullah. It's a complicated spectrum of identity and history and geography and demographics. But there are different worldviews that are so far enlightened than what I think, you know, we see as the mainstream within Western capitalist society. So yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, it's a kind of going. I don't think it's a going back, right? Because I think that kind of romanticizes and belittles, right? I think it's a going forward with, if we can.
Nik, thank you again. That was fascinating. I was curious how much what you have been experiencing working with Maurice has also been happening in the community. And how, in other words, has this agricultural work also developed a community or a community spirit? Your comments about rich white people being able to come in and buy land makes me worried that it's only partial.
I mean, I think that it's a great question. Thank you. And thank you for your comments. I mean, I think, you know, part of this research has also reinforced to me that the notion of community is problematic. Right? Now we talk about holisms and like the notion of the community or a community, and there's no the community, there's no a community. That again, we're variegated, we're complicated, we have our own self-interests and issues. You know, Sapelo Island is like that, right? There are factions within the community. There are people that don't want us to be doing this. Like there are people, Maurice gets attention now in a particular way because of some of these things. His mother got a lot of attention, and it built up a lot of resentment. And so there are tensions there. That said, I think, and Maurice said this to me 4 years ago. He said, like, this is going to be hard. This is going to be really hard, Nik. So, like, if you, like so many other people, wander off and don't come back, you know, I'll know what to do with that. But he said that if we're able to start kind of showing proof of concept, not his language, if we're able to kind of do some of this work, people will take note. They will come out. They will get involved. And that is happening. That is happening. The picture a while ago of us making the cane syrup, huge turnout of community members. So, I mean, I think it's a slow but steady thing. And so the thing is like this pressure of the things that, you know, he and the community is fighting against versus how to enlist enough folks and do the work. Yeah. Oh. I'll have another sip of water.
Thank you for your talk, Nick. I did try to find my discuss and comments to the first time you presented this. I could not, so I have two different questions today.
Okay.
And one of them is a kind of follow-up to the last question, and it's a query, really, I suppose. Could you say something more about the kinds of ethics, the methodological implications that you're hinting at just now between the, what you might call a kind of ethnographic refusal on the part of yourself and thinking through the kind of refusal that one gets from a community and what that might mean for doing this kind of work as scholars, as activists, as scholar activists. And then the second question is in a sort of a different domain and has to do with the sort of reconstitution. Let me see if I can remember what I wrote here. The plantation agrarian assemblages that are being reconstituted and how, by which I mean the sugar, indigo, and so on. How that, if you could say something more about the ways in which this reconstitution is sort of maybe transformative and maybe what some of the elements that make it different than its original constitution. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, easy questions. Thank you. We had a meeting 3 years ago, January. This is a huge community meeting. Like it was said to have been the largest community meeting that had occurred on Sapelo in years, like a decade plus. And Maurice and I stood up to talk about what we were doing. And two members of the community in the back stood up and started yelling and screaming and pounding desks and telling us that we shouldn't be there, and I certainly shouldn't be there, and UGA was just trying to steal land. And I was terrified, because every insecurity with all of this, with my UGA hat on, which I don't have, but was like, oh, he's right. I shouldn't be here. Like, oh shit. And I just turned to Maurice and I said, what do we do? And Maurice is so conflict adverse, which is interesting given, some of the things that we've gotten ourselves into. And he said, like, this is not going to happen today. Let's go. And so we packed up our bags. We walked out and we stood outside the door. And we let the person that was yelling continue to yell, and then people started to stream out, and then we started to talk to them as they came out and have individual dialogues. And that's like one of the hardest moments of this. That is an episode that like we always talk about because we've tried to figure out ways of negotiating it and doing some of this work. And if I'm being 100% honest with you, Alex, I don't really know. I don't really have an answer to your first question. And I don't, not as it is a total cop-out. But I mean, I think that like some of this is just, I wasn't trained. I don't know. I'm not capable of doing much of this by myself. And had Miss Cornelia not, asked me to do this, I wouldn't be doing this, I don't think, Last conversation I had with her after Hurricane Irma was promising her that we would grow the sugarcane that she wanted, and then she died, And so, like, there's like a weird kind of stuckedness. Fortunately, there's a lot of, I do obviously benefit. I mean, hell, I'm here, I get to be here talking to you about this, so I'm not trying to suggest that, there's nothing that comes out of this for me. There's a lot. Beyond just the experience that I've known. But I don't know how to reconcile some of those issues. I think the same is true of the latter question. Again, we talk about it. We talk about, like, how is this different than when this was a plantation driving the transatlantic slave trade? Or I asked that question. And Maurice says, well, it's my ancestors' knowledge. It's different, Nick. Don't stop. Just stop being, sensitive. I'm like, but how can I not be sensitive, Maurice? So there are these incommensurabilities. Maybe that's the answer, is that there is no easy solution to this. The circumstances that racial capitalism and settler colonialism have created present us with incommensurable scenarios where, like the best we got going right now is like we get on really well, and I think he trusts me, and I certainly trust him, and we're like stumbling forward. Yeah, that's it. That's all I got. Dramatic stop.